Hi, y'all. My name is Marni F, and I'm a grateful recovering sexaholic. I am just delighted to be here. It is so awesome to me to stand in front of this group and see this many people who are this committed to your recovery. It's just really an incredible experience. I'm very humbled to speak to you tonight. You know, this is an honesty program, so I'll lead with my weakness. I have to tell you that I have really stressed about what to wear, you know. I mean, I'm an addict, you know, and I talked to Bob R. when he called me, and he said, well, you know, the speakers usually dress up. That would be fine, and I stressed over that, and I called my sponsor, and I stressed over that, and finally she said, Marni, it is not going to matter. And of course, I could imagine that what I wore wouldn't matter, but, you know, anyway, but actually what I deal with today is as much the character defect of pride as my sexaholism. God's really dealing with me about that. And my temptation is to lust after a reputation of being the paragon of Ms. S.A. recovery. And I surrender that. Every day since I was asked to speak, I have gotten down on my knees, as I did this morning, as I did this afternoon, and just a few minutes ago in the bathroom, and said, God, remind me that this is not about me. This is about the message. And so my prayer is that what you will hear tonight is the message of hope of what God has done for me that I could not possibly do for myself, and that I'll be able to get out of the way and share with you my experience, strength, and hope that it is possible to live in sobriety one day at a time, in serenity, and to just share with you what it was like and what happened and what it's like today. When I came into recovery in July of 1991, I was a mess. I was broken and confused and scared and fearful and sick and abandoned and hopeless and suicidal. I knew that I could not go on living the double life that I was, and that I was way too afraid to die. I literally was very, very sick. I had completely lost my health from the devastation of this disease. I literally had chronic diarrhea for almost 3 years, just from all the angst of living out daily this disease, and knowing I was powerless to do anything about it, and truly not being able to stop on my own willpower. When I came into recovery, I was intensely involved with the man who lived across the street. I was married at the time, so this was an extramarital affair. That had cooled a little bit, not completely, and I became even much more intensely involved with the man who lived next door. So we had this real, sick triangle going here. And it was a very, very codependent relationship. It was a very enmeshed relationship, a very sick relationship. I knew at that point, when I realized that I was acting out with two men in my own neighborhood, a stone's throw from my own home, the same day, that my life was completely unmanageable. My husband was very severely depressed. He was completely shut down, not able to be beyond the barest of functioning. We had 2 children who were very young at the time. They had been profoundly abandoned by my addiction, by my husband's co-addiction, and they were very, very angry. And that's what life was like when I came into the program. My sex addiction, I think, began when I was about 3 years old. When I was 18 months old, my mother was diagnosed with late stages of colon cancer, and she lived until a little after my 3rd birthday. When my mother died, my father, who is a minister and an educator and a sexaholic, poured his emotions, I think, into his work, whether it was his preaching in his church or his teaching in the universities or his addiction. And I felt so abandoned and so alone and so worthless, because I was sure that if I had been good enough, that my mother wouldn't have died to leave me, and that if I had been good enough, that my father would have spent some time with me. And I didn't understand what was so horribly wrong, but I knew that it had something to do with me. My family operated by the rules that probably y'all are very familiar with. Rules like you don't talk. In my home, we didn't talk about the fact that my mother had lived, much less the fact that she had died. The rule was you don't feel. It is not okay to feel any negative kind of emotion, except guilt. We did guilt really well, but but you can't feel anything besides guilt or joy or happiness. And when I would say to someone, like the little ladies in my father's church, you know, I really miss my mama, I was told, but your mother's in a much better place. You know, I really didn't care about that. All I knew was that I was very, very lonely, and I was very afraid, and I knew that there was something horribly wrong with me. When I was 5 years old, though, my life changed a lot, and I thought at the time that it changed a lot for the better. A man came to live with our family when I was 5 years old. He had come to the university where my father taught. Our extended families had been good friends for a long time. And this man came to go to college. He was 20 and I was 5. And we had this immediate kind of connection. He paid attention to me. He took me roller skating every Saturday for years. He would sit and read poetry to me out in the grass. We would write together. He fostered the writing that I was already at that age interested in. Little did he know, I guess, that would become a career at one point for me. I loved this man, and he loved me, I thought. And from the time I was 5 until I left my father's home to marry when I was 20, this man sexually abused me. I never thought about those things as abuse for a couple of reasons. Number one, I loved this man. I loved being with him. I'd do anything in the world to be with him. So how could it possibly be abuse when we had that kind of a relationship? But I will tell you tonight that the other reason that I never thought about these experiences as abusive was because I loved the sex. He was very tender with me. He was very nurturing. As I got older and reached puberty, he taught me very specifically to be orgasmic, and I loved him, and I loved the sex. And I could never imagine that there was anything different about this relationship other than I was a whore. You know, I was a minister's daughter. I knew that that kind of sexual activity was wrong, but I loved him and I loved the sex. So there's no other way to sort that out in my mind. I was also exposed to a good bit of pornography in my home. I grew up in a house full of men. I had 2 older brothers and my father and a variety of other men who came to live in our home. So there was a lot of pornography around, and I learned very early how to use my sexuality to get what I thought I wanted or what I needed. And I became really good at that. I was very promiscuous as a teen, and I thought, as perhaps you did, okay, when I get married, this will stop. You know, marriage will cure it. When sex is legal and moral, then that's going to take care of the problem. And so I married a guy I met in college and didn't understand at all at the time that he was another very wounded spirit. His family looked a lot different from mine, but he was equally wounded and abandoned and hurting. And we got together like a good friend of mine calls heat-seeking missiles. Of course, we were sexual before we married, but, you know, that was okay because I was going to marry him. And I really thought it would be okay because we had dated for a couple of years, and I was actually faithful to him, which was the first time in my experience that had happened. So I thought, okay, this is going to be great. And we married in this huge wedding of the century. You know, I had 12 bridesmaids, and it was at Christmas, and it had white flocked Christmas trees, and it was just really very decadent and kind of obscene. But it suited my personality really well. And, you know, so we got married, and I thought, okay, I will be faithful. And I was for a year. And literally on the day that was our first wedding anniversary, I slept with my husband's best friend. Because, you see, I had found out in that year that this man couldn't fill up that black hole inside. I really couldn't even articulate what that black hole was about, but it was there, and it was gnawing, and it was aching, and he couldn't fill it up, and I was mad as hell. And so I thought, well, gosh, obviously I have married the wrong person, and kind of too late to do much about that at this stage, so I will just get my needs met somewhere else. And I did. Not surprisingly, ultimately I lost that marriage because of my addiction. We were married a total of 4 years. We were separated about 1 of those years. By the grace of God, we did not have any children together. And of course I lied completely, about having any affairs, and it was all his fault because he began to drink and to spend, and he brought his own set of problems into the relationship. So it was very easy for me to believe that this was not at all about me, that this was about him, because he couldn't meet my needs and because he had his own stuff. So I lost that marriage. In about a year, I remarried to the man who is still my husband. In an absolute miracle, we've been married 17 years this fall. David was 10 years older than I am, and was a very, very stable man. My first husband was very much like my father, very flamboyant, very charismatic, and I thought, I've been there and done that, and that didn't work, so I'm going to pick this man. And I say this with great love today, but if David were a color, he would be beige. He's just as rock solid and as stable as they come, and I thought, okay, this is going to be what will fix me. This will be the man of my dreams. And we married, and again, I was sure that I would be faithful. And then there was actually an awfully serious test. He lived in Orlando at the time. I lived in Atlanta, so this was a long-distance kind of relationship. No accountability about that. And we had that kind of a relationship for about 6 months before we married, and I had plenty of offers, and I didn't take anybody up on it. So I thought, hey, okay, I have proven myself now. I'm over this. This is going to be fine. So David and I married, and for the first 5 years, it was very calm. Until recovery, actually until probably the last 3 or 4 years of recovery, it was the calmest period of my life. We married. We were very compatible, much more so than my first husband and I. We shared very similar backgrounds, very similar belief systems, values, ways of approaching life, money, all of that kind of thing. We had 2 children, which had always been a dream of mine. I was able to stay home with those children, which had also always been a dream of mine. And David made enough money that we could do that without any particular problem. Life was good. I thought, hey, this is great. And I distinctly remember on my 30th birthday, we'd gotten very involved in our church again, and we'd had a large group of people from our church over to our home for a birthday party for me on my 30th birthday. And I really remember thinking that day, thank you, God, I'm over all of that, whatever it was. I've kind of finally grown up, and I've settled down, and I've gotten over myself, and, things are fine. And I really thought they were. 5 years was a long period of calm. And then the stresses began to hit. They really didn't have anything to do with between me and David, but they were more external. Things like we buried 4 family members in a year. He decided he was working for a huge Fortune 100 company in a very responsible position, and therefore was traveling all the time. He was not home very often, and if he wasn't traveling, he would leave the house about 6:30 in the morning and get home about 7:30 in the evening. Does this sound in the least bit familiar, to some other parts of my life? And he decided that really wasn't fun anymore and that the money wasn't worth it. His father was diagnosed with a terminal disease. My father's sexaholism became front page news on a very large local newspaper. My father had to leave his pastorate, leave his university. So all of these stresses were happening, and we decided that the thing to do was for us to move halfway across the country and back home to the hometown where we grew up to take care of our families and to start over, and we bought a business. We cut our income that first year by 2/3. We're just now beginning to make, 12 years later, what he was making 12 years ago when he left the big company. So all those kinds of external stresses. Well, I reacted out of my addict style the way I always react, which was just, give me, make me feel better about all this, calm my emotions about all this. It's up to you to make me okay with all this that's going on. And David, bless his heart, reacted out of his family system, which was just to withdraw. And the more that he withdrew and the more that he shut down, the more I pursued and the worse things got. Until finally there came a day that I looked at him and I said, you must learn to love me and make me feel better, or by damn I'll find somebody who will. And I did. And that began a period of about 5 years of serious acting out again. David couldn't meet my needs. It wasn't his fault, because he has a disease called co-addiction, but I didn't know that then. And I blamed him. And I began a pattern of many extramarital affairs. Ultimately, I settled with the musician across the street, and he wasn't quite it, so then I settled with the guy next door. And that relationship was going to save me, I was sure. I was positive that I really loved this man, that he was going to be my human savior. It was a very, very intense relationship. Ultimately lasted about 3.5 years. And I was being torn apart inside if I would let myself feel anything, but I was too busy medicating all that by acting out. So I didn't feel a whole lot until March of 1990. And in March of 1990, I was diagnosed with cervical cancer caused by a sexually transmitted disease. I couldn't imagine that that could ever have happened to me, you know. I mean, I really thought I was pretty high class about these affairs, you know. It had been forever since I had gone to a bar and picked up somebody I didn't know. You know, I always acted out with these nice men that I already knew. And I was just devastated to find out that this was the reality for me. In some ways it was made almost worse because all the church ladies just surrounded our family. Here I was this young mother. I had these 2 little kids, and I had cervical cancer, and they, you know, bring casseroles to our house, and they bring me flowers, and they take my children. And I know the secret of why. And it just, my shame just increased and increased. Over that next year, I had 3 major surgeries, and literally almost died. After one of the surgeries, about 10 days after the surgery, I woke up in the middle of the night and the bed was covered in blood and I was hemorrhaging. And I called the doctor's answering service, and of course they immediately patched me in, and I'm laying on the bathroom floor with my legs up on the toilet and a towel shoved between my legs, and my husband is there trying to be with me, and the doctor's saying on the other end of the phone, Marni, you have about 4 minutes. If this bleeding doesn't stop then, you have to call 911 and go to the hospital because you're going to bleed to death. And all I could think about as I heard Dr. Zimmerman's voice on the phone was, okay, that sounds real good, Doc. Now would you just please hang up so I can call this guy next door and tell him I love him one more time before I die. I was really, really sick. My last surgery was a complete hysterectomy, and that was the one that finally took care of my disease. Wish they had done that the first time. That was a bunch easier than the first and the second. And I came home from the hospital from that hysterectomy on Easter Sunday in 1991. And our tradition had been on Easter Sunday that we would go to my father's church, and he was preaching now for a tiny little bitty church about an hour and a half away, and, you know, spend that day with him. And, of course, I was too sick to go, so I sent my husband and my kids, which was real convenient because then this affair partner could leave his choir and come home and spend, you know, an hour and a half with me before he had to go back for the second service. So, you know, that was really convenient, so I had to stay to myself. And he came over, and what I really wanted was just to be held. I was scared, and I was in pain. And what he wanted was to be sexual. And I don't blame him for that, because he also has a disease called sexaholism. But I didn't want to, and I was afraid. And I was afraid it would hurt. And it did hurt. And I did it anyway. And I knew that day, for the first time, that moment of clarity came, and I thought, your life is absolutely out of control. But I couldn't stop. I seriously at that point wanted to stop. And I did stop hundreds of times. But I couldn't stay stopped from that relationship. Eventually my body healed, but I found that nothing could heal my soul. And when I could no longer live with a double life, and I looked in the mirror, and I saw this, wonderful religious person who was singing in the choir and doing these special solos on Sunday morning and teaching a class and writing this grand inspirational material and publishing it and sharing it, going across the state with different ladies groups. And I would leave one of those kinds of meetings on an evening and go home and act out with this man before I went to my own home. And I finally said, I can't do this anymore. And I became suicidal. And what happened was that my higher power had continually been pursuing me. I had turned my back on him, and I really didn't care anymore. And I thought I was way beyond his help because, you see, I was just a whore. But God still loved me, and he was pursuing me. And he had paved the way for me to get the help that I needed. And a good friend of mine was already hooked up with a counselor. And I called her, and I was seriously suicidal. And bless her heart, she turned around and called her counselor, who called me back within 30 minutes. And we talked for a little while on the phone, and I made an appointment 2 or 3 days later, and I began the journey. When I first got to that counselor's office, I was determined to be honest, and I was. I told her about my acting out. I told her about my history. Had a lot of head knowledge at that point that all of this had something to do with my father and had something to do with my mother. And I could articulate some of that, but I didn't have any kind of emotional healing about any of that. And the counselor leaned back and she said, well, tell me, Marni, how long were you sexually abused? First session. I was like, no, not me. You don't understand. My family was really screwed up, but not that. That never happened to me. She was just like, okay. And I told her that because I had never framed what happened to me as sexual abuse. And it was several months before that became clear to me. When finally she said, okay, tell me about your first sexual experience. And I told her about being with this man when our activity had finally progressed to the point of intercourse. And I was 14 or 15. I haven't quite been able to figure that out. And she's like, okay, and how old was he? And I said, he's 35. And she said, wait a minute. That's sexual abuse. And then to realize that it had actually began at age 5. That was a really freeing thing for me. As odd as it sounds, I was so glad to be a sexual abuse survivor because it meant there was a reason why I was so screwed up. And that was a really freeing thing for me. I did a whole lot of work those first months in therapy, a lot of work around my family of origin issues. I confronted my father about the abuse and about his relationships with men that had allowed this abuser to come into our home. Because, you see, my abuser was a partner of my father's in his acting out. But through these months, I was still acting out. I was still very much tied to this man next door. David didn't really understand what was going on with me. He couldn't really be supportive or sympathetic. He was in so much pain himself. But I couldn't understand that about him. We were both just very, very angry with each other and very disappointed. And eventually we separated in the house, which was a very healing thing for us. And eventually, in baby steps, I began to disentangle from this addict partner who was next door. But I found that as the pain would get worse, I would keep going back and had never really been able to achieve any sobriety. I wasn't going to meetings. I was going to do this by myself. Thank you very much. I had no tools of recovery. I had a therapist, and she was great, but I saw her once a week. And then one morning at the breakfast table, and this addict partner is there with me. We're drinking coffee, and, they had taken the kids to school, and my husband was at work. And I opened the paper and saw the obituary for a former addict partner who had died of AIDS. And that got my attention, because I knew that there, but for the grace of God, go I. And that day, I went to my first sex addiction meeting and began to admit I am truly powerless over this disease. I had to realize that I wasn't responsible for being a sexaholic, that it wasn't my fault that I was in that place, that it came from my abuse, it came from my abandonment, and it was up to me to do something about it. That I could be a victim all my life, or I could be a sober survivor, and that the choice was up to me. I entered a period of seriously working a program, got sober, and after about 8 weeks, had a major relapse with this person. The pain just got great again, and I decided it just wasn't worth it, that I could control and manage lust, and re-entered a relationship with this person. And there was a day that I was on the phone with him, and my husband was gone, and our children were playing in the backyard, I thought, and I really realized that I hadn't seen my then 5-year-old son for a good while. And I decided, I probably ought to look for him, but I kept on the phone, and then I realized this has kind of been a while. And I went in the backyard, and he's not there. His big sister was there. No, she hasn't seen him. And I went upstairs to his room, and the door was closed, and that was unusual. And I tried to open the door, and it wouldn't open, and that was more unusual. And finally I put my shoulder to that door, and I pushed with all my might, because there had been a chair wedged from the other side up under that door. And I opened that door to find that my 5-year-old son in the act of being molested by a neighborhood teen. And finally that got my attention, because you see, I had done to my kids exactly what had been done to me. And on August the 8th, 1992, it was that date, I said, by the grace of God, I will, one day at a time, be sober. And by His grace and the fellowship of this program, I have been sober since August the 8th, 1992. What is it like now? At that point, I became willing to go to any lengths. Finally became willing to go to any lengths. My husband and I agreed to stay together for 1 year at that point, just for the sake of our son and his sister, to put our energy into their health and well-being and into family counseling. We physically moved out of that neighborhood, sold our house, bought another one. That was a God thing. Within 3 weeks, God had put into our laps the house of our dreams. I got a sponsor, worked the steps, went to meetings, and one day at a time had stayed sober and found a new way to live. The gifts of recovery have been amazing. To me, probably the greatest gift has been the sense of spirituality. I'd had all the religion I could take. Someone told me once that religion is for those who want to avoid hell. Spirituality is for those of us who have been to hell, and we want a different way. I have had my view of God healed, and it was in desperate need of healing. I have found a God who is a loving, caring being who will not abandon me and who will not abuse me. I have found peace physically, emotionally, spiritually. The relationship with my children is such a gift to me. My children know all of our story. It's kind of dangerous to tell your children about your story. My daughter, who's 15, will say sometimes as I'm trying to caution her about something, "Mom, I'm not a sex addict. Chill." Or my son will say, "Mom, I think you need to go to a meeting." But that's cool. That's wonderful. That's a gift. Professionally, I have been given an opportunity to work in this field. As part of the journey, I went back to graduate school and became a marriage and family therapist, and I specialize in working with female sex addicts, and that has been a wonderful gift. God has done for me what I could not do for myself. If I had been allowed to choose, I would never have chosen this life, because I'm just not that courageous. I'm just not. God didn't give me that opportunity, and I'm so grateful, because today I would not have changed it for the world. I am infinitely sorry for the pain I have caused my husband, and particularly my children. But I wouldn't have changed the rest of it, because it has given us back our life. And I'm so grateful to be with you tonight. Thank you.